Americans for Prosperity is committed to breaking barriers across the country, and Americans for Prosperity is growing across North Dakota. By calling on lawmakers to reduce taxes, spend less, improve health care, and provide second chances, we can empower all North Dakotans to rise. We're fighting for you. Join us today so we can make North Dakota the best state to live, work, and raise a family. Americans for Prosperity paid for this ad. How are we going to get North Dakota back to work? I think that's on the minds of everybody. I think everybody would like to get back to normal. I know a lot of people would like to get a haircut. I would like to. That's one thing I'm really looking forward to is getting my hair cut again, because I'm at that point in my life where I don't have a lot of hair on top anymore, and growing that hair long, what hair I do, just accentuates the fact that I don't really have a lot of hair up there, and I really need to do something about that. Although that's probably pretty low on the list of everybody's priorities. Mostly, we just need to get people back to work. We got to get back to normal at some point. We're having a debate about that. There's been protests in North Dakota. There's protests across the country urging our political leaders to reopen. And I don't think there's a political leader in this country who wouldn't love to reopen things. The problem is, how do we do it the right way? How do we do it in a way that's sustainable and that's not going to create a re-eruption of this problem and maybe force us back into a shutdown or force us back into more economic harm? We've got to do this the right way. So here to talk with me about that is North Dakota Commerce Commissioner Michelle Kommer. Michelle, how are you? Hello, Michelle.
Hey, Rob. How are you?
Yeah. Well, I heard you laughing at my bald joke, so thanks for that, first of all. And second of all, before we get into it, let's talk a little bit about this this audit situation, because this kind of popped up right as I booked you for this, and mostly what I wanted to talk about was the economic stuff and reopening the state's economy. But I want to ask you about this other, because I'm sure my listeners are wondering about it. Last year we saw an audit from State Auditor Josh Gallion. He said that in his audit that there was the possibility of some criminal wrongdoing related to the procurement of a state. Basically, it was an effort to create a brand new logo for the state, and he alleged that there may have been some criminal wrongdoing there. Attorney General Wayne Stenjum referred it, for the sake, I guess, of avoiding a conflict of interest, referred it to South Dakota authorities. They came back. They didn't find any criminal wrongdoing. So at this point, I guess you've been exonerated. How do you feel about that process?
Yeah, Rob. Well, I think there's, of course, a certain amount of relief, excuse me, but a lot of frustration and probably even a little bit of anger, a touch of anger now that it is all done, when you get to look back and notice that none of this had to happen this way. So, excuse me, as you point out, we had a routine audit back in the latter half of the year. There were a few findings, and I want to first address what this is not about. This isn't about an agency that doesn't want transparency, that doesn't welcome the scrutiny of a well-prepared, well-scoped professional audit, and it isn't a story of an agency that doesn't want to learn how to do things better. I actually started my profession as an auditor, and so I'm very familiar with the professional principles and how one should determine the scope of an audit and the materiality. And I had the good fortune to work for a boss who 25 years ago was transitioning the profession to one that was called value-added auditing. And basically, that's how most audits, professional audits, are done today, with the idea that you can still retain your independence, but you can also be cooperative and you can work together to identify solutions, and that it doesn't have to be the scary gotcha sort of auditing. And so that was the mindset with which I and my entire agency had approached this from the outset. And so we were absolutely shocked in the middle of October to learn that our audit had been referred for criminal investigation. My first question was, what does that even mean? And there were so many procedural peculiarities along the way that to this point have no explanation I think some of those questions still need to be answered, Rob. The audit was referred for investigation under a statute that governs purchasing cards.
Yeah.
And there were no purchasing cards used in our audit.
Yeah.
There was a statute, continues to be a statute in Chapter 54 that defines the process that has always been used when the auditor's office wants to refer an audit for criminal investigation. And that process is through the Legislative Audit and Fiscal Review Committee. And as I've said before, I think we're so fortunate in this country to have this beautifully designed system of democracy that ensures for separation of powers. And that's exactly why that system is designed that way, that the auditor goes to the committee, presents his opinion, and the committee votes to determine if it should be referred. And he didn't follow that process, and it still perplexes me. I said earlier today, you can't drive down the street and decide that you're going to stop at this stop sign, but today you're not going to stop at the red lights. And I have heard no explanation other than I was just doing my job for why the proper procedure wasn't followed and why this strange, obscure procedure was.
Honestly, and this is larger than just your issue. Obviously, there's been a dust up between the auditor and the legislature. And I'll be honest, I've mostly come down on the side of the auditor. I don't because I do believe in separation of powers. And I also believe in the idea of having an independent auditor. The legislature during their last session tried to make it so that the auditor had to come on bended knee to them to ask permission to audit. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that at all. And I don't think that the auditors also come under criticism for releasing his audits directly to the public instead of waiting to present those audits to the LAFRC committee. So I don't necessarily have a problem with him doing that. I agree with you, however, and this came up in the open records realm, which is an area of law that I work in a lot. It is technically, in some instances, a crime to withhold or to manipulate open records data, right? Like if you try to change a record, or if you say there is no record and there really is a record, that's a crime. And I've had a lot of conversations with our Attorney General Wayne Stendrum about this, because I've been frustrated about people who have just deliberately tried to keep records from me or gave me the runaround. And at what point is there some accountability here? And the point that he made is that if you invoke the criminal code, we're going to create a lot of extra problems, right? Because if you go through the criminal process, there's all sorts of jurisprudence. And what's our goal? Our goal is we want the records out. Our goal is we want people to be able to get the records. And so if we go the criminal route, we may not reach that goal. We may have the satisfying thing, I guess, of causing somebody a headache, but we're not necessarily going to reach our goal. And I look at that here. I'm not so sure, because I think Auditor Gallion has taken anything that even looks casually like maybe a technical violation of criminal law or something. He wants to refer that for investigation. And I don't know. That to me sounds like we're going to try to kill every gnat with a sledgehammer, which sounds like a way to waste a lot of resources and a lot of time. And in your instance, I don't think there was wrongdoing. I think some mistakes were made, but I don't think there was any criminal wrongdoing. And at the end of the day, I just want the corrects to be the mistakes to be flagged and corrected in a manner that's transparent to the public. That's it.
And we want the same thing there, Rob. And I think if you look at our case in particular, what to me seemed almost un-American about this process is that it wasn't until we received the letter from Julie Lawyer, the Burleigh State attorney, on April 20th that we had any idea what law was even suspected to have been broken. Yeah. So we find out in mid-October that our audit is being referred for criminal investigation. And as you point out, we had some findings. We didn't agree with all of them. They were incorrect, but we concurred with one of them. But it was absolutely in the course of doing a person's job, and our team believed that we were doing it right. There was a safety valve to have handled that differently, and we didn't. Why? Because we thought we were doing it right. And as was reported in the state's attorney's letter, the money got to the right place for the right purpose. There was no waste, and
Yeah.
the transaction was done in the course of somebody's
Yeah,
job.
to refer something like that, to refer something like that as a crime. I mean, it's one thing if somebody's,
it's terrifying.
It's one thing if
Terrifying.
somebody's putting money in their pocket and taking it home, right? Okay, that's a crime. That needs to go to the courts and be an investigation and a trial and everything else. It's another thing of, well, maybe we didn't follow some of the arcane budgeting rules the right way. You know, I'm actually kind of reminded of like the tax code, right? Years ago, a congressman famously called the IRS helpline, like called the different lines for the different regions of the country with the same tax problem, and got like 5 different answers, right? Sometimes our code can be so dense and contradictory and everything else that it's just hard to know what, like even the experts who are in charge of administering the policy don't necessarily know the right way. So there was no ill will here. There was no criminal intent. Nobody was trying to put one over on the taxpayers. You did it one way, and maybe you should have done it the other way. I mean, to me, that's okay. We did the audit. We flagged it. We're going to fix it. That should just be the end of it. We don't need the criminal investigation. I think Gallion was wrong for referring it. It was wrong. And also, there's also the problem where you're a public official doing the public's business. Basically, somebody is saying you did the public's business the wrong way, not in a way that was self-dealing or embezzlement or anything like that, but you didn't follow this rule. You did it this way. You should have done it that way. And now all of a sudden you're put in a position of having to hire your own lawyer, right? Because the state of North Dakota didn't provide counsel for you. I don't know that there's any provisions in law for the state of North Dakota to even do that if you personally are accused of a crime.
Well, and let me tell you that there's complexity there too, because as I pointed out, we didn't know what crime had been committed, what crime had suspected to have been committed.
So how do you even begin to defend yourself?
There's a provision that says the state can't defend you if you've been accused of a crime. But in this case, no one had been accused of a crime. Yeah. It was as if someone went looking for a crime. And so one could say that the state should have represented us because we didn't fall into the category of people that had been accused of committing crime. We were executing our job responsibilities.
Yeah.
So that's a whole other question that I think remains open. But as it is today, yes, I am not the only one that had to retain personal counsel. I've had questions asked of me or around me, why did you retain counsel if you didn't do anything wrong? And as an attorney myself, I would say when you are told that something you're involved in, a function that you lead, in fact, is being referred for criminal investigation, and no one has told you what crime is suspected of having been committed or by who, no one needs a lawyer more than you.
Right. Well, I absolutely hate that question. Well, why did you lawyer up? Well, you should, because lawyers protect your rights and they protect you in situations that frankly put you in jeopardy. I mean, if somebody's accusing you of a crime, they are putting your money and your life and your liberty in jeopardy, and you deserve protection. The person, and what's the famous saying, right? The person who represents themselves has a fool for a client. Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with getting legal counsel. So that's all what it is. I will conclude by saying this. I like that the Auditor Gallion has pushed back on some of the legislature's attempt to, maybe people could disagree with me or disagree with me. It's kind of a separation of powers debate. I like the idea of an independent and very aggressive auditor. I think in some of these recent instances, particularly with you, Auditor Gallion went too far. And he's going to have to face voters over that, and maybe he can explain himself as time goes on. And he's been on the podcast several times. I'll get him on, and we'll talk that out as well. But I'm glad.
Well,
I think we reached the right resolution in this one. I just wish it hadn't had to take this path.
Yeah, I agree. And the clarity that I still seek, and perhaps you can help with this, Rob, is the choice between the two statutes and why use for the first time the one that seems to be cobbled together for convenience sake versus the other. Yeah. I actually share your view on a powerful and independent auditor's office. We don't disagree there, but the procedure there, and then also this matter of criminal charges, the auditor's office has said, we don't deal in criminal matters. That's for the Attorney General's office, or that's for someone else. Well, I don't know if that's entirely the case. I have an email where the title, the subject of the email says, seeking charges. And it is unclear to me to this very day where in our process the decision was made that there was something criminal to further pursuit, something substantive, something that caused that referral other than an accounting error that was very, very clearly explained in our response. So, the bottom line for me is that there's still some questions that need to be answered. If we're talking about transparency, let's be transparent. And then let's be really honest with ourselves about the waste that has occurred here and the damage that's been caused. We'll see some real numbers that will monetize attorney's fees, but we will never see the real damage that's been caused by the stain on North Dakota during this time and the stain on public employment and public service. And that's a real concern to me. And I think there needs to be some accountability.
Well, I read Governor Burgum's statement on some of this, and I sense, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I sense in him a frustration because he's a big one for innovation in government. Like he's a guy that just wants to do things. And I think that gets him in trouble because in government by definition has to be collaborative. And I think sometimes that's a challenge for him. I think he's very much an executive. I think he'd just like to go and do things. But I like Doug. I think Doug does a great job. But I think one area where he is absolutely right is this has the potential, if I'm reading what he's saying right, this has the potential to stifle innovation in government. Like people who are saying, well, let's try things a new way. Let's try to get creative. Let's think outside of the box. All those things that I think most of us, would think of as good things. People are going to be afraid to do that. Because if you trip over some rule or some somebody chooses to define a statute or define a policy in a different way than maybe you are, now all of a sudden instead of maybe being guilty of a difference of opinion or a difference of style, you're guilty of a crime. I don't want that situation to exist in North Dakota's government.
I share that view. It has, and it's real. This has had a chilling effect, a paralyzing effect, especially immediately after the audit. We have at the Department of Commerce, really towards the end of the year, we had to decide. We had no resolution, and we had to decide how are we going to behave here. And we decided that we were going to take the high road, and we're going to continue to do the work that is our mission to do, because it's why we all showed up here in the first place. But there is I guess we'll call it a hangover that will probably exist for some time. And we may say that we're past it and we're through it, but it's absolutely created a really deep internal concern about innovation and thinking creatively and taking risks, of course, inside the confines of our systems and what's appropriate. And again, you can't put a cost on that, but it exists. There is a cost, and I think that needs to be acknowledged.
Well, let's talk about something. Let's talk about something that's more fun: the coronavirus. Right? You like that segue? Yeah. That's why I make the big bucks. Yeah. We the medium-sized dollars. I wrote a column, and I did this before because Governor Burgum, I know yesterday at his press conference was talking about a lot of this is how do we reopen the government? How do we get there? And he's talking about, his term is what? It's a smart reopen, right? Or a smart restart.
Yep, North Dakota smart restart. Yep.
Smart restart. North Dakota smart restart. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this ended up because my column was I had used a term, that Governor Burgum's been using a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, compared to some other states. Yeah. And I think that's very smart. And I'm saying, let's get the scalpel out again. Let's look at some business. Obviously, there are businesses, and I think that's your mandate now, if I'm understanding things right. There are businesses that have been operating in our state the whole time. Grocery stores, some retail stores, they're still open. And I realize some of them have modified their policies or modified their hours. But they've been able to continue open. And so far, I haven't heard of an outbreak from Target. I haven't heard of an outbreak from Walmart or from Cashwise or one of our great grocery stores or anything like that. It seems like they've been able to operate safely and continue to serve our needs. And I mean, they've had to. I don't know what we would do if we had shut down the grocery stores. My goodness. I'm wondering if there are things that we can learn from those businesses and apply it to other types of businesses and get at least some North Dakotans back to work. Is that what you're working on right now?
That's exactly what we're working on, Rob. And I want to go back to your first point that I think that there was extraordinary wisdom exercised in Governor Burgum's decision to not go the shelter in place route. Even though our restrictions were in many ways very similar, we didn't have the added psychological element of the state is closed. And I think that at some point in the future, we're going to really see that wisdom show up in metrics, because we spend all our time talking about lowering the curve. But I think these decisions that we've made to this point have also raised the bottom. And I think that we'll see that bear out in the future. As you point out, there were a number of business types that were closed by executive order effective March 20th. They were mostly personal services, and other businesses where you come into very close personal contact. And so the rest of the state is still open. Many businesses have modified their practices. Some have voluntarily closed, but we have fewer businesses closed in North Dakota by executive order, by mandate, than most other states. And I think that is going to turn out to be really positive. So to your point, I think we have exercised the scalpel both on our way into this, and we intend to on our way out of this. So where the Department of Commerce has pivoted its work to as of last week, prior to which we were really focused on making sure that North Dakota businesses understood the federal resources as best as we possibly could, so that we could be very quick to act, and we were, and we can talk about that if you'd like to. But moving ahead now, what the Department of Commerce is working on is we're working with work groups. So starting last week, we began to establish work groups to represent the businesses that were closed by executive order. So here we're talking about what we refer to as the cosmetology cluster. That would include salons and barbers and manicure and pedicure shops, estheticians, tanning beds, close personal contact types of organizations. And these 6 work groups that we have established are made up of association representatives where there are associations. And we're fortunate that in a number of these industries there were. So how convenient is that to be working with an organization that exists to represent the industry? And where there weren't associations, we've been using our networks to get in touch with people that would be willing to stand in and represent their industry, not just their individual business, to say, hey, here's what we think can be our path to opening. Balancing these 2 principles. One, how can we do this safely so we don't have a rebound like you talked about? And second, how do we inspire consumer confidence? And those things really go hand in hand. I think it's a really unique situation in a good way, in the sense that we all share the same motivation. Often you come to the table and there might be different motivations, and, those cause complications in a conversation, but we share the motivation that we want to get our economy back up and running. We want to get people back to work. We want to get people out of their houses, because it's not just an economic issue. It's about mental health and isolation. And so that work is happening this week. Yesterday morning, 4 of these work groups met. They're working on establishing these protocols. We're working extremely fast. I know that government and fast aren't often in the same sentence, but I will tell you from my experience, that's the only way the Department of Commerce operates. So we can just kind of put that stereotype aside. And we're planning to have draft opening protocols ready by tomorrow night. So I want to be really clear about one thing, though. The Commerce Department is working on the how with business and industry. We are not working on the when. The when will be triggered by health metrics, and between the governor's office and the Department of Health, determining how are we doing with our infection spread and infection control. Do we have adequate PPE? How are we doing with our contact tracing infrastructure? How do we feel about whether or not our most vulnerable populations are protected? And when we get the green light, the idea is that we are ready. And to your point about laser or scalpel, we're just so lucky in North Dakota. I mean, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else in this pandemic for a number of reasons, but we have citizens volunteering their ideas long before we established these work groups. And, I'll give you an example. Today, we received a letter from the State Board of Cosmetology And I want to say, to people that send us their ideas and their thoughts, if you think that we're not listening, we're not just listening, but we're bringing those ideas into the conversation. And they proposed on their own. And I have to imagine that this was in the works well before we put this group together, that there's a way for these sole proprietors to get back to work even before maybe the larger practitioner shops do. And they described how that could work. And so, working together, we're going to figure this out. This is a very heavy burden for state leadership, because you're balancing lives and livelihoods, and you're trying to not let it be the tyranny of the or. You're trying to work through to get to the genius of the and. And it's a huge burden, because we certainly don't want to move too soon and see infection spikes that are harder to control. But I think we've got the best possible process.
I keep telling people it's like chemotherapy, right? Where we have a disease, but the cure could kill you too. And it's kind of a race between the two, is trying to, obviously, and I'm one. Coronavirus is serious. I think there's been some people out there dismissing it, and we shouldn't. It's a serious thing. I think one of the reasons why North Dakota has, relative to other parts of the country, certainly relative to other parts of the world, why it's had such a light touch here, is because we did what we did. And we have some built-in help too, where we're very rural and very, very spread out communities to begin with. I mean, it's not like New York where people are crowding into subways or things like that. So what? I mean, how does this process work? I mean, are you going to identify like certain types of businesses? Like if they come with you a plan and the plan's good enough, and the governor decides, okay, now's the time. The data's showing us now's the time where we can maybe start taking our foot off the gas pedal on some of the restrictions. I mean, is it basically like, okay, well, the barbers came to us with a good plan, so barbers, you can open up if you follow this plan. Is that how it works?
No, that's a great question. It's not a race to put together the best plan and then you get the green light, and those of you that didn't organize well don't. It's a calculated risks that we're trying to make sure are taken wisely. And so, we are working with these work groups to put together plans and protocols for their businesses. And then, like I said, we're working on the how, but that has to be married with the when, with the health metrics. And so, you can expect that it will be gradual. Again, back to your point earlier, the scalpel, it will be gradual. It will be perhaps isolated. It will be perhaps local. We have counties where, for example, there are no employers that have more than 10 people in a work site, where it's a frontier county and there's only 4 people per square mile, where there's no infection. And we may choose to employ some different back to work procedures in a county like that. And that's a may. These things have not been determined, but we're considering all of these factors, when it comes to how do we step into the next phase of a smart restart. And again, it's calculated risk, and we're working with industry, not doing something to them in the way that we had to when it came to trying to control the virus, in March. And as I've heard it said, it was easier to get into this than it is going to be to get out of it. What that means is, doing an executive order that applies uniformly to everyone is easy, certainly hard on livelihoods and hard on people and hard on economies, but it's easy. Getting out of it in a smart way is harder, because you're taking those calculated risks and you're saying, okay, so as the cosmetology board suggests, maybe next week, and again, not decided, but maybe next week, our sole proprietor shops can't.
I have to apologize. Michelle cut off there for a moment. I'm certain that my ISP is probably feeling the strain, and we're doing this call obviously over the internet so that I can record it. But I have Michelle back, and if you just want to finish your thought there, Michelle, and then I had one more question for you.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, I think when we got cut off, I was probably saying that just repeating, I really wouldn't want to be anywhere else going through this, because the cooperative spirit is palpable. we are looking forward to moving ahead and, opening up the economy in a really smart way and showing the rest of the nation how that can be done.
Certainly. Last question, and this is something I have always thought in public policy and just philosophically. To me, it's sort of a bedrock truth about governing, particularly in a place like America, and maybe even more particularly in a place like North Dakota, is that sometimes people just aren't going to follow the law. And I always use the use tax in North Dakota. I think Ryan Rauschenberger is the only person in North Dakota who pays the use tax because he's the tax commissioner, right? I actually asked him about it one time. Nobody pays this tax. Technically, if you buy something in another state and you bring it here to use it, you're supposed to pay the state of North Dakota a tax on it. Nobody does it. The state of North Dakota is not really enforcing it. So, it's just sort of a law that's hanging out there that nobody's obeying because I think everybody's just kind of decided, well, that's a dumb law. I think there can reach a point where people just they're only going to be pushed so far before they're just going to do what they're going to do. And I think that's a real possibility in the coming weeks with some of these shutdown things. So I know you're saying, well, we're not putting a clock on this thing. It's going to be dictated by the data. But there is a certain political reality where certainly as we're starting to see with some of these protests, and I'm not endorsing this, but there may reach a point where people are just going to do what they're going to do. And the government's ability to keep people locked down is limited. So, I mean, there is a timeline on this, whether you like it or not. Is that entering the thinking at all?
Absolutely. I agree with you, Rob, and I think the administration acknowledges that as well. It's part of the dynamic here. And on the other hand, though, as people begin to see friends and neighbors and grandparents get infected and die, that changes things too. And we've been so fortunate, not that any death is acceptable, but we know that our numbers are less than in other states. And so that close personal connection may not be as profound here in North Dakota, and we don't want it to ever get that way. So we got to balance those two things. But yes, that is part of the thinking.
Well, Michelle, I thank you for your time. I know you're busy. I won't use up any more of it. Thank you for coming on, answering the questions, and good luck. I think everybody needs it right now. I appreciate it.
And before you go, I want to say thank you to you as well, because I really appreciate your approach, Rob. You don't settle for the soundbite, and you go 3 clicks deeper. And I think that is a service that is really important in North Dakota, especially right now. So thank you.
Well, I can tell you that flattering the interviewer will get you everywhere. So thank you for that.
All right. You have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.